Hi folks. So not so much thinking out loud with this video, more sort of sharing a thought out loud, I think, really thinking about this idea of consumer web adoption versus AI adoption so far. And it used to be the case, I think, that consumer technology adoption gave us an indication of where workplace and professional usage might go. And it certainly, so I suppose, set a standard. I'm not sure that that's true at the moment. I think things are quite different with generative AI, and I just wanted to I suppose, explore that thought in a few categories. And I'd like, yeah, let me know what you think as well, and how far this is a helpful thought for the foundation of what might come next. So consumer web adoption is quite habitual usage. We know what it's for. Deep and frequent usage. We're all sort of daily drivers, visiting our favorite apps and tools quite frequently, using a lot of content. I remember in the early days of, sort of page impressions per visit, visits per user, etc. Those kind of frequency measures were what we were aiming at. At the moment, I think generative AI tools presented as sort of, I suppose, a chat interface. Chat GPT famously doesn't have that depth and frequency of use. It's kind of, I think, as Benedict Evans has suggested, it's sort of a mile wide and an inch deep. So that daily frequent usage is a rarity. That's sort of not normal. Those are kind of, heavy users and early adopters are not setting the standard for consumer adoption yet. So it's different. One of the reasons I think it's different is actually that the best user experience in generative AI is in the agent space and pro accounts, and you have to pay for those. You have to pay arguably quite a lot of money, particularly in this economy. It's 15 to 20 pounds or dollars per month. That's quite a lot compared to what we are used to as sort of free usage of ad-supported tools and apps on our mobiles and on our laptops as consumers and on our TVs. Okay, so increasingly as consumers, so high quality access to experiences and content is free. That's not yet true. The best experience in generative AI is paid for at the moment, or it's actually professional, perhaps. We'll come to that in a moment. So the consumer use is the best UX in consumer tech in digital technologies. That's very rarely true in the workplace. That's the sort of the challenge we have in workplace technologies is that these applications and systems, the ERPs, HCM modules, LMSs, all of that stuff, the learning content and e-learning, it's just not as good as our consumer experience. Actually, maybe the best UX for AI is actually embedded in apps at work. It's sort of the stuff that supports personalization, discovery, and sort of the scale of personal experience, and allows us to interface with those systems in a better way. I don't know, maybe that's emerging. That's a theory, perhaps, but it's certainly a different experience, I think. Um, I think in the consumer web adoption, the utility value has been obvious. So in the early days, Google search kind of made the internet work. In a way, it made the web work. You could find stuff, and then you could, transfer money from one account to another quite easily. You could do your shopping. You could buy a CD, for those of us who are old enough to remember what they are, and then that's transferred into sort of doom scrolling, the kind of endless quest for engagement and trapping us into those devices. Entertainment, doom scrolling, and engagement being that kind of consumer driver. I don't think it's clear at all what the utility value is for consumers of generative AI. Looking at that Mark Zhao Saunders research into sort of what the AI in the wild, there's some sort of, it's kind of odd. There's some odd patterns of behavior there with sort of therapy, tarot readings, etc. Alongside agentic coding, vibe coding, etc. And lots of sharper utility. But I just, we're not certain of what that experience is for yet. We don't really know what we're supposed to do with it. Hence that sort of lower frequency and depth of usage. I'm not quite sure, like, how does this fit in my daily life? Part of the reason I think is that the generative AI is a conversational interface, and that's a bit weird. It's a bit new and a bit different. Not quite sure. When I talk to a computer, what do I do? Should I expect? Maybe that's one of the reasons that therapy and that kind of life management use case has been so prevalent, because it's conversational and it feels like you're talking to something responsive and intelligent. You're not. You're talking to a robot. And the UI, I suppose, and consumer web technologies has been quite mechanical. It's the cursor, it's the form field, it's the click and drag, or just click and play, and it's quite transactional. So it's pretty straightforward. It fits that kind of utility value in the first instances, and then the kind of the swipe action on mobile has been quite clear as well. So I think there's something about that kind of utility value and the UI that's quick, clear on the web. I think conversational UI and this sort of opaque value is something that we're not quite sure. We haven't quite figured out what that is good for yet. And maybe AI chat is just not a good use case. Maybe the product market fit is poor. We shall see. I guess as well, this is really important, I think, as well, particularly in translating adoption from the consumer context to the workplace. And my recollection of the trust environment for for the web over the last 20 years has been reasonably positive, or at least neutral. Until more recently, and then when I think some of the tech bros and the tech billionaires have probably sort of burnt some trust bridges. But the trust in AI is low. At least it's uncertain. And I think that translates into a workplace environment of requiring very, very clear use cases, clear benefits, and perhaps those aren't sharpened yet. I think the agentic model perhaps is going to start to change that, but that's as yet unknown. Anyway, so there's some thoughts from me on the difference between our experience of consumer web adoption and AI adoption so far, and I think there's something about this opacity and vagueness and lack of clarity about what the technology is good for, how it works, what it does for me, the jobs to be done, etc., that I don't think is clear yet. And I think that's something that we're going to have to think hard about overcoming if adoption in the workplace is going to be fruitful and purposeful and have that utility value. Anyway, be interested to know what you think. Those are some top of mind thoughts from me. Let me know.